As I was leaving, I look on the right side and I see that there's a wolf head looking down, peering in at me.
Tales of a canine cryptid dubbed the Dogman begin in the oral histories of the Odawa tribes in what is now Michigan.
From a routine hunting trip to capturing the most terrifying photos ever taken of the Michigan Dogman, this is the story that shook even the most experienced hunters. The story begins. The legend of the Dogman is super popular all across Michigan. People talk about it, share stories, and pass it down, but not everyone knows how it really began. Believe it or not, the whole thing started as a prank.
The Dogman legend is very popular across Michigan, but some people may not know it all started as a prank.
But what began as a joke quickly took a dark turn. In the middle of the wilderness, far from any town or city, the silence of the night was broken by a strange sound. It wasn't something you could easily explain. It came from just outside a cabin sitting all alone in the woods. That's where it happened. This is how one hunter, Joe Barger, ended up capturing the creepiest Michigan Dogman encounter ever caught on a trail camera. Sometimes the stories we hear sound too bizarre to be real, like the ones where someone swears they saw Bigfoot, or a ghost, or something from another world.
The first documented claim of a Dogman appears in 1887, when lumberjacks in Wexford County survive an encounter with what they describe as a monstrous amalgamation of hound and human.
And usually what makes those stories so unbelievable is the lack of solid proof. It's always hearsay, always a blurry photo, nothing you can hold up as real evidence. Well, that changes today, because now we have something different. Thanks to a trail cam, we finally have actual footage of something truly strange. Something that no one, not even the hunter who filmed it, could explain away. It all happened to a man named Joe Barger, a native of Michigan, who was out in the wilderness when he captured something shocking, something that didn't belong in the forest. And what makes his story even crazier is that Joe isn't just any guy walking around the woods. He's an experienced outdoorsman, a guy who lives for nature. Over the years, he's built a reputation for going where most people won't go. He loves adventure, he loves exploring, and he's known for pushing into parts of the forest that most people avoid. So when Joe tells you something happened, people listen. In an interview, Joe walked us through exactly what happened that day. He said it started out pretty normal.
I was picking up a load, and as I was coming back, there was an air leak that I had, so I pulled in here. I just got out my tools and got underneath, and that's when I noticed the atmosphere was really different.
He was just picking up a load and heading back when he realized there was an air leak. Because of that, he had to pull over in an area he knew well. And that's when things started to shift. During this stop, while out on another one of his wilderness trips, Joe crossed into a space where the line between real life and imagination started to blur. He talked about how his love for the outdoors started when he was just a kid. He'd been camping and exploring Michigan's woods from a really young age. And over time, all those adventures made him a seasoned hiker, someone with deep knowledge of the land and its creatures.
So, as anybody would, I've never heard of a Dogman. I didn't know what it was. The first thing that was going through my mind, time slows down.
That experience helped him feel comfortable in places that would scare most people. And on one particular night, it would also help him survive something he never expected. That night started off peacefully. Joe was just enjoying a quiet evening at his cabin, way out in the middle of the Michigan wilderness. He was trying to relax and feel at one with nature, something he'd done many times before. But once the sun went down, everything changed. He said the air felt weird. There was this strange stillness around him, a kind of pressure. Something just felt off. He'd been to that cabin hundreds of times. He thought it was the best place to enjoy nature, to go fishing, or to spot some deer before heading back inside. But this night was different. Something wasn't right. As soon as he noticed how strange everything felt, Joe started to feel uneasy. His instincts were kicking in, and then it hit him. The forest was completely silent, not a single sound. No crickets, no coyotes, not even an owl hooting. He said sometimes, on regular nights, you'd hear the occasional hoot of an owl or the howl of a distant animal. But on this night, nothing. It was dead quiet. So quiet, in fact, that you could probably hear a pin drop, and that's when it happened. Joe said he was approached by something. He didn't know what it was, but it cast a shadow. The moon was coming up, it was nearly full, and in that low light, Joe saw a shape moving near him. He tried to stay calm. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the strange weather. Maybe he'd had a couple drinks. Nothing to panic about, right? He went about his routine. One part of that routine was setting up a trail camera, something he did pretty often. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary for him. He had several trail cams scattered across the area, just to catch glimpses of forest life at night. He liked collecting footage of animals wandering around in the dark, and this particular camera was brand new. It even had night vision. Joe figured it'd be perfect for spotting animals without disturbing them. So, he set it up near the cabin. He didn't expect anything unusual. He just wanted to see what kind of nighttime activity was happening nearby. But what he didn't know was that this one camera would end up recording something that would change everything he thought he knew about those woods. The sound that shouldn't exist. It had been building up for a while now. Even when Joe made his way back to the cabin, the strange feeling in the air hadn't gone away. In fact, it felt stronger. As if something had shifted in the forest. Like the woods were holding their breath. He couldn't see or hear a single animal. Nothing moved. Not a chirp, not a flutter. It was like the entire forest had gone completely still, or had left altogether. Joe tried to brush it off. Maybe the animals had just moved to another part of the woods. Maybe it was natural. He didn't want to overthink it. After a simple dinner, he decided to call it a night. But getting any rest was easier said than done. The silence was just too much. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, like something was out there in the dark, watching. And then, just when he was starting to drift off, the stillness broke. Joe's sleep was cut short by a sound. But this wasn't just any sound. It was something that shook him to his core. It wasn't the sound of wind or a branch snapping. It wasn't even a howl. It was unnerving, unlike anything he had ever heard in his life. And keep in mind, Joe had spent years in these woods. He'd grown up out here. He knew the calls of birds, the howls of coyotes, even the screeches of owls in the night. But this was something else. Even in the interview, as he tried to describe it, you could tell it still gave him chills. It started as a low, faint growl, but not the kind you'd hear from a bear or a wolf. This growl was different. It sounded deep, guttural, almost like it was coming from inside a giant, like something was trying to speak but didn't have the right voice. Joe said it didn't stop there. That growl began to shift. It started to change, slowly turning into a high-pitched wail, a sound that rose and rose until it pierced the night like a scream. Joe said it was like listening to a banshee, some kind of wild, otherworldly creature shrieking into the black sky. It wasn't just loud. It felt primal. That's the word he used. Primal. Something that hits your instincts, makes you freeze, sends your body into full alert. Even though Joe had seen it all, heard it all, lived in the woods for most of his life, this sound left a mark on him. It was something he knew he'd never forget. And as it echoed through the trees, that fear, the kind you don't admit out loud, took over. Of course Joe was terrified. Who wouldn't be? But instead of panicking, he tried to calm himself down, tried to think rationally. Maybe, just maybe, it was an animal. One he hadn't come across before. Michigan has wolverines. Maybe a panther? Some wild cat out there? It wasn't impossible. They're rare, but it could happen. He tried to convince himself of that. But no matter what explanation he reached for, nothing matched what he had heard. The sound was just too strange, too unreal. And then, something made it worse. It was getting closer. That noise, it wasn't staying in the distance. It was getting closer. Joe started to feel the sounds moving toward him, surrounding him. As if whatever was out there wasn't just howling at the sky, it was headed right for his cabin. He said it felt like the vibrations were actually moving through the walls. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was something physical, something you could feel. The fear hit hard. Joe, still shaken, started scrambling to figure out what could be going on. His mind went through every possibility, desperate for a logical answer. Could someone be messing with him? A prank maybe? If so, it was going way too far. It wasn't funny anymore. But before he could settle on that idea, another thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't about him? What if someone else was out there? Someone in trouble? Someone making those noises? Someone who needed help? The fear didn't go away, but now Joe had something else to think about. Something just as urgent. What or who was out there in the dark? Joe knew he had no choice. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going away on its own, and if he stayed frozen in fear, that thing might just come straight to him. He must have swallowed a huge gulp in those moments, because stepping out into the night was probably the hardest thing he'd ever done. But he did it, because he had to. It wasn't just fear, it was pure dread. Joe was convinced this thing wasn't human. He couldn't explain how or why, but something deep inside told him that whatever was moving out there was far too powerful and primal to be anything natural. Even the thought of confronting it made his knees weak. According to Joe, his heart was beating so hard in his chest it sounded like a drum. And the howls? They were still echoing. Loud, relentless, bone-chilling. He was drenched in sweat and frozen stiff. If he could have clicked his heels and vanished back home, he would have. But somehow, he moved. Joe found the strength to turn and run, not because he was brave, but because he knew this thing had the upper hand. This wasn't his land. He had stepped into its territory, and it was closing in. But as he tried to escape, Joe would come face to face with a sight so disturbing, so out of this world, that nothing could have prepared him for it. The sound, that sound, it kept creeping closer. Every second it got louder, closer, deadlier. Joe had no choice. He slipped out of bed and tiptoed through the cabin, trying not to breathe too loud, let alone make a sound. Outside, the forest was cloaked in darkness, but thankfully, the moonlight gave just enough glow to see. Pale silver rays lit up the edges of the trees, and with every step Joe took, he noticed strange shadows moving between the branches. He stared out into the woods, squinting, trying to make out what was lurking out there. Then suddenly, there was movement. Something shifted between the trees. Quick, large, not an animal, not a man. He couldn't tell what it was at first, but then, the wolf head. It locked eyes with him, not from a distance, right beside his moving vehicle. Joe would later recall how it kept up with him, even while he was driving 20 miles per hour. A bear? No chance. A wolf? Not a chance either. This thing wasn't just running, it was running on two legs. Whatever had been trailing him in the woods was now beside his truck, upright, fast, and aware. That's when the truth hit him. It was real. It was out there. And it was watching him. Looking back, Joe swore that the creature had to be big, strong, aggressive, not something you'd want to meet alone in the middle of a dark forest. Especially not when you're sure you're being hunted. What could possibly make a terrifying moment even worse? For Joe, it was the light. Just when the scene couldn't get any more intense, a sudden flash of light, whether from the moon or something else entirely, lit up the forest floor for just a second. But that second was all Joe needed to see it clearly. Right there, in front of him, was the creature. And this time, he could see it fully. It had eyes, real eyes, staring straight into his, and what he saw, he would never forget. The first thing that hit Joe was the sheer size of the thing. It was massive, taller than any man he'd ever come across. Towering, bipedal, and just standing there like it belonged in the woods. Its entire body was covered in thick, matted fur. Not sleek like a bear, not shaggy like a dog. It looked coarse, heavy, wild, like something that had never been tamed. But none of that compared to the eyes. Those eyes. Even in the shadows, Joe could make out their glow, bright, focused, unblinking. They locked onto him with a kind of awareness that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just some beast acting on instinct. There was something behind those eyes, something smart, something calculating. Frozen to the spot, Joe didn't move, he didn't breathe. His only hope was that this thing hadn't noticed him, or at least didn't care. And in that moment, he got lucky. Because the creature, instead of charging at him or growling, just paused, lifted its head, sniffed the air. Joe said he saw its jaw stretch wide, and what stood out most was a row of enormous, bone-white canine teeth. The creature's mouth was powerful. Its jaws? Massive. Joe could see how easily it could crush something, maybe someone, without hesitation. And then, it turned, Just like that, the creature walked away, disappearing back into the forest from where it came. No warning, no threat, no sound except the fading of that deep, guttural growl still echoing through the trees. Joe stood there, shaking. He didn't know whether to cry, collapse, or run. He just knew one thing. He had seen something that should not exist. Even now, Joe can still describe it, down to the last detail. Its face was the most disturbing part. It had a snout, but not like a wolf's or a bear's. It was almost human, a distorted mix. Like if a person's face had started to change, stretching forward into a muzzle, lined with sharp, uneven teeth. The jawline was broad and strong, almost like a bodybuilder's. Its forehead was wide, sloping, and thick with fur, but those eyes, they stayed with him. They glowed like a cat's in the dark, but they weren't animalistic. They were aware and intelligent. They looked at Joe not like prey, but like something they understood, something they had already judged. Joe wasn't just scared by what he saw, he was shaken by what it meant. This creature wasn't just out there. It knew exactly what it was doing, and it let him go. To this day, Joe says those eyes are carved into his memory like deep cuts in bark. They weren't like anything he had ever seen, on TV, in books, or in real life. That stare, it locked onto him like a predator to prey. And no matter how hard he tries, Joe simply cannot forget that moment. Even long after the encounter, Joe still remembers what it felt like to sit by the fire pit outside his cabin and glance up at that hill that led into the tree line. There was always a sense that something was watching. That feeling was always strongest at night. And now, after what he saw, he knew he was never alone out there. The creature wasn't like anything he could have expected. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something different, something alien to this world, like a glitch in nature. Joe said it felt like this thing crawled straight out of the pit of the forest, as if the woods themselves had been hiding it all along. Whatever it was, it challenged everything Joe thought he knew about the natural world. But as surreal as it all felt, he had proof, because thankfully, Joe's trail cam caught it.
As you said, the footage kind of begins at 1:30 in the morning, 1:33 a.m. As you see in the pathway I mentioned earlier, it's pretty open, but surrounded by all that dense forest we talked about.
At 1:34 a.m., the footage showed it clearly. From the shadows, it emerged, step by step, massive, upright, on two legs. By comparing it to the surrounding trees, you could tell just how big it really was. Maybe even bigger than some of the thinner tree trunks. This thing was muscular too, not just tall, wide shoulders, huge chest, covered head to toe in thick, dark fur, but the strength underneath was obvious.
It's far larger than any typical forest animal. As I described it earlier, it's standing upright with two legs, kind of robust, muscular frame, covered in this black, brown, dark fur. And then, there, it pauses, kind of raises its head, and sniffs the air. You can see its eyes catching the moonlight with that eerie glow I was talking about. And then right here shortly after, it turns its head, almost like it's looking directly into the camera. That's a chilling moment for me every time I watch this footage, because that face partially shadowed out, but you can see some of the features I described. And then, as quick as it appeared, and abruptly leaves. It blends right back into the wilderness, and
You could see the power in how it moved. Then it paused, lifted its head, sniffed the air, and right then, moonlight hit its eyes. The eerie glow. That same glow Joe had seen face to face. It was unmistakable. And just like in his memory, it vanished. Back into the woods, swallowed by the dark. The footage ran on, but the creature never came back. Not that night. Joe later admitted that moment still haunts him. Every time he watches the footage, it sends a chill down his spine. It was real. And he has proof. When asked if he ever returned to that cabin after the encounter, Joe didn't hesitate and said no. The experience shook him. He hadn't gone back since. And that was saying something, because Joe wasn't the kind of guy to get scared. He'd spent countless nights in pitch-black woods, gone on hunts in total darkness, but nothing had ever scared him like this creature. And yet, even through the fear, Joe admits something else. He's fascinated. There's a part of him that's still drawn to the mystery, a part of him that wants to understand what he saw, what it meant. where it came from. Why him?
This is all 100% factual truth. Never heard of a cryptid called the Dogman.
The cabin used to be his escape, his place of peace and solitude. But now it's different. Now it's the place where the veil was pulled back, where he saw something that didn't belong in this world. Still, Joe hasn't given up on the wilderness. He respects it now more than ever. Yes, it's unpredictable. Yes, it's terrifying, but it's also full of secrets. Things we haven't discovered, things we might not be ready for. He says one day he'll go back, carefully, cautiously. He plans to set up more trail cams. He wants to be prepared, just in case it shows up again. And who knows? Maybe it wasn't alone. Joe says he's not going back to chase monsters. He's going to reconnect with nature, to reclaim that part of himself. But if fate crosses his path with the creature again, well, at least this time he'll be watching. This story, the eerie sounds, the glowing eyes, the massive shape that came out of the trees, is more than just a local legend. Thanks to Joe's footage, it's now one of the clearest, creepiest trail cam captures of the Michigan Dogman anyone's ever seen.